Great. So in this part of today's webinar, I'm going to be talking about the list feature on close discovery. So throughout the presentation, I'll be explaining what the list feature is and going through some potential use cases, and I'll be ending with a short demonstration as well. So as this is a new feature, we plan to make improvements and we'd like to hear from our users. So feedback at the end of the webinar is encouraged. And I also encourage you to try it out after the presentation and let us know your thoughts on the feedback form on the Discovery website too. So first off, I'm just going to provide a bit of background about Closer. So we are the UK's partnership of social and biomedical longitudinal population studies, the UK Data Service and the British Library. We've been funded by the ESRC since 2012 and we're based at the UCL Social Research Institute. Our overall mission is to increase the visibility, use and impact of longitudinal population studies, data and research. So Closer represents multiple UK longitudinal population studies. We currently have 19 studies, which you can see on the slide, in the partnership. That comprises of both national and regional studies from across the UK. We've got several areas of work and resources within Closer, but today we're going to be focusing on Closer's flagship resource, Closer Discovery. So just so I can get a sense, if you're familiar with Closer Discovery or if you've used it before, can you please just do a quick thumbs up reaction just so I can get a sense of who's heard of us? Great, so I can see a good few thumbs up there. Great. So for those of you who might be less familiar, I'll just provide some context about Close Discovery. So Close Discovery is the UK's most comprehensive research tool for longitudinal population studies. It allows users to search, browse and explore rich questionnaire and dataset metadata for over 10 longitudinal population studies. It's the only tool that you can use to search across UK longitudinal population studies to identify similar questions asked of participants, variables on a particular topic, and how variables were measured in the original questionnaires. In today's webinar, I'll be focusing on Close Discovery's list feature. So, as I said, there's a wealth of rich questionnaire and dataset metadata on Close Discovery, but how can we keep a record of all the information that we've found that we're interested in? Well, this is where our list feature comes in, as it allows you to save questions, variables, questionnaires and datasets to a list. These lists can be downloaded in several formats, so PDF, CSV, Excel and XML files. Some of those have more information than others, and I'll show you examples of each of these different formats later on in the demonstration. The list can be kept private or made public with a persistent identifier similar to a DOI, which could be linked to a journal article, for example, to show what data sets and variables you've used in your analyses, which contributes to more transparent and open science. So, when would we want to use a list? Well, first off, I'm going to ask you if you can think of any reasons why or some circumstances when you think it would be helpful to have downloadable lists of the variables and data sets that you're interested in or that you're using. So please feel free if you want to just unmute and shout out or just pop a message in the chat if you'd prefer before I talk through some of the use cases that we'd thought of. Yeah, I can see some typing. To present to my team what would constitute as outcome and risk factors for a potential new study. Yeah, so kind of sharing with your team like potential variables and things that you might be interested in for a research project. That sounds good. As a way to keep track of the data and variables that you're using in your analyses. Yeah, so for kind of your own purpose so you don't forget them maybe later on down the line. If you're trying to do a comparative study between different longitudinal data sets and want to make sure they're truly comparable, yeah. So yeah, that's some great different types of examples and I guess a range of personal uses and things that might help other people as well. So that's great. Yeah, so now I'm going to talk through some of the things that we had thought of. So, one use case is that they could be used when you're doing some preliminary research or scoping exercises, such as finding possible studies, datasets, or variables to use in your research. So, the variable metadata in closer discovery includes summary statistics. So, you can use these to assess whether the data contains information that you need, and then you can save this information to a list that you can go back later to look at it, or you can share it with other people. The questionnaire metadata in Discovery also makes it easy to understand what was asked of the respondents, as we've documented the questionnaires in a clean and structured way. And collecting this information about the questions and the variables saves you time because you can assess whether the data is right for you before you spend time accessing it or requesting it, which can be pretty time consuming if the data is behind a paywall or in a TRE, for example. So we've got lots of helpful information on Discovery, and lists are a more permanent way of organising and storing this information, which helps and saves time for your future self. If you're conducting primary research, lists could also be helpful for finding and creating lists of possible questions that you could use when you're creating your own questionnaire or survey. They can also be helpful if you're wanting to find more information or get access to data. So if you've found some variables or data sets that you want to use, but you need some more information about them, you could send your list of variables to the study and get some responses to your queries. And they could also be used to make the data request process easier, as you could download your list of variables and data sets and then send that to the study when you request the data so they know exactly what you're asking for. And then whether you're deciding on what variables to use or you're working on a project using variables or datasets in Discovery, it could be helpful to share your list with others. For example, if you're a PhD student looking for data to use, you could share the list of variables and datasets that you've found with your supervisor for them to look at and assess to see whether they think they're appropriate. Or if you're working on a project with collaborators who don't have access to the data that you're using, you could share your list with them so that they have more details about the data. So they can see the summary statistics for the variables without having to actually access the data themselves. And finally, if you've used the variables or data for a publication, you could download and add the list to your supplementary materials for your paper so that the readers have a better understanding of the data that you've used, which again contributes to more transparent and open science. So now that we've described what the list feature is and some possible kind of use cases for them, I'm now going to show you how you can create and download a list on Close Discovery. So in this example, I'm going to pretend that I'm a researcher who wants to do a piece of research on the topic of marriage and specifically people's attitudes towards marriage. So the first thing that I need to do is make sure that I'm logged in order to be able to use the list feature. And this is really quick and easy to do if you haven't created an account already. So you just need to navigate to the top of the page and either press login or create an account. And then once I'm logged in, and you can see that I'm logged in because it has my email at the top of the screen, I'm going to search for some keywords to find variables or questions that might be of interest to me. So as I'm interested in the topic of attitudes towards marriage, I'm going to do a search for attitudes marriage and see what comes up. So I've got a few relevant search results. I can see some variables which have the labels marriage is for life and marriage gives you economic security. So I could just add these to a list straight away by clicking the add to list button, which you can see on the right hand side. But I think I need a bit more information about these variables first before I decide how relevant or useful they could be to me. So I'm going to click on the top variable from the British cohort study, which has the variable label marriages for life, and see if I can find some more information about it. So the first thing that I can see is the summary statistics for the variable. So I can see there are a low number of missing or invalid responses, which is good for my analyses, but I'd like to know a bit more. I'd like to know exactly what question was asked to participants to generate this variable. So I'm going to click on the Source Questions tab. And now I can see the exact question that was asked of the respondents. So having this extra context is really helpful because I can see that the question was asked as part of a group of questions on attitudes and views. And looking at this list, I can see that there's another question that sounds interesting and relevant to me. So divorce is too easy to get these days. So having the questionnaire metadata has allowed me to see exactly what question was asked and has also pointed me to other potential questions of interest. So after looking at the dataset and questionnaire metadata, I'm pretty sure that this is a variable that I'd like to use. So now I want to add it to a list so I can keep a record of the variables and questions that I could use for this research project. So if I scroll up to the top of this page, I can add them to my list by clicking on the box next to the variable label Marriages for Life. And I know it's been added because there's now a tick in the box and the grey number next to lists at the top should increase every time you add another item to your list. So to view and edit this list, I'll just click on Lists at the top of the page. And here you can view all of your lists. So you can see that the status of my list is active. And if you have multiple lists, you'll need to make sure that the list that you want to add things to is the one that's active. You can see that I've edited this list because it has a bit more of a descriptive title, so I've called it Marriage Attitudes Study. And so to do this, I just clicked on the title of the list, which then brings up the things that I've added to my list. So far it's just the variable that we found earlier. And if I scroll down, you can see that I can edit or remove my list. So I'm going to click on Edit. And here I can change the details of the list, such as the title, which, like I said, I've already done. I can also add in the PI, and I can provide a description, a citation, or a persistent identifier. And I can also make the list publicly viewable by clicking on Make this list public, so the little box next to that. And then skipping forward a bit, assuming that I've found all the relevant variables and questions that I'd like to add to my list, I can then download it in a variety of formats that I could keep for my future self or I could share with other people. So to do this, I'm just going to go back to my list and then click Download Metadata, which then presents me with a range of different format options. So each of the download options provides varying levels of information. So if we start by having a look at the PDF, we're presented with a nice report-looking document which provides comprehensive information about the variables. So we have all the information that we found earlier about the variables and questions, as well as what topics that variable was assigned to, and the dataset and the sweep that it comes from. And I think this would be ideal for collaborations. For example, if you're working on a project with people who didn't have access to the data, you could download this and send it to them so they can see detailed information about the questions and the variables that you're using. And you could also submit this as supplementary materials when you're publishing a journal article so that the readers can get a comprehensive view of the data that's being used. We can also download the list as a CSV or Excel file, which is a much more stripped back version and contains information about the study, dataset, variable name, label, and codes. And this might be useful for keeping personal records of your data because unlike the PDF, it's editable. So you can move things around, you can add comments, you can add other columns and so on. And you could also send this to the data providers to request access to data, as they'd likely just need a list of the variables that you're interested in wanting access to. And finally, we can also download the list as XML. So you could use this to save all of the questions that you want to use in your own survey to a list, download this XML, and then upload that to your systems to reuse those questions. So as you can see, there's multiple different formats with varying levels of information to suit your needs. So in terms of our next steps for this feature, we'd like to add some example lists to Close Discovery, such as creating lists of the variables that we've used in our training datasets. But if anyone else also has any feedback or suggestions of other things that we could do that might be helpful for you, then please feel free to raise them at the end of the webinar or get in touch with us afterwards. So to summarise what we've just gone through, lists can be useful at all stages of the research lifecycle, from scoping out your possible datasets right the way through to publication. They can be created for individual or collaborative purposes. They can be private or made public with a persistent identifier. They can be downloaded in a variety of formats to suit your needs. And as I've mentioned, this is a new feature, so we'd love to hear your thoughts about what you liked about it or any improvements that you'd like to see. So that's it from me, and I'm happy to take any questions, and I'd love to hear your feedback as well. Thanks.